Thank you. The next item of business is a debate on motion 19980 in the name of Pauline McNeill on transparency in tackling group-based child sexual exploitation and abuse. I would invite those members who would wish to speak in the debate to please press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Pauline McNeill to speak to and to move the motion. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you. Grooming vulnerable children for sexual exploitation is one of the most heinous crimes that can be committed. But for it to be compounded by systematic failures by institutions who are meant to protect those children, and for the crimes to have been conducted for so long and at such a scale, is unforgivable and a scar on our society. The scale of these crimes in Rotherham and Rochdale was unprecedented. Hundreds of vulnerable girls, many in local authority care, systematically groomed, plied with drugs and alcohol and trafficked. Professor Alexis J., who did the report in Rotherham, said that there were 1,400 victims alone, and a common thread in Manchester and South Yorkshire was the catastrophic failure of agencies, including the police, local councils and social services. So what made the Scottish Government so complacent about Scotland? What made the Scottish Government think that they could dismiss calls for independent reviews? And what made the Government believe that it could dismiss the amendment to the Victims' Bills by justifying the Government's position by misusing a quote by Professor Alexis J., who serves on the National Child Sexual Abuse and Exploitation Group? Because they were complacent. What a complete mess the Government have got themselves into. Today, they've had to cave in, and now they've done what they should have done in the first place, and that's an independent review. Despite this, Scottish Labour does welcome this last-minute announcement that Professor J will lead a review of the handling of complaints against grooming gangs, which could lead to an inquiry. We want a full and unfettered access for Professor J for all the data, and it must be done urgently. We want there to be independent oversight of Police Scotland's review of historic and current cases, so that they are not effectively marking their own homework. We know Scotland is not immune to organised grooming gangs, and we've seen, many of us, the interview given by Taylor, who relayed a horrific account of what happened to her aged 13. She says she was sexually exploited by grooming gangs. ITV's Peter Smith reports that in Taylor's care records, staff at the care unit described her as disruptive, and that she was encouraged to wear less fake tan and makeup and stop drawing attention to herself. It's utterly shocking. Taylor went on to say, importantly, that she was added to a list of 45 other children kept by Police Scotland who were vulnerable to sexual exploitation. But no one yet knows what happened to that list and if further action was taken. In fact, Taylor said that no one at the care unit asked her any questions about it, despite her records clearly documenting that there were concerns that she was being sexually exploited. So does anyone need any convincing that there are similar threads to Rotherham and Rochdale on what we've learned in recent weeks? So there must be transparency about exactly what we know about the scale of problem in Scotland. There must be an assessment of how we are protecting children in care, who are the most vulnerable children in our society. What changes do we need to make to ensure children's protection is paramount. Baroness Casey told the Home Affairs Committee in June this year, "I think we don't necessarily look hard enough to find these children. In particular, it is clear that it is still happening." And she said, "We don't have enough data in Scotland, and currently we urgently need to change that because we know very little." As Joni Reid MP has said, who has been championing this cause, we need independent experts looking at the case files, whether they are open or not, interviewing victims, speaking to social workers and educational establishments who have supported those children and young people when they have been making their accusations. And this summer, the previous Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, said on the law of rape would be tightened so that adults who use consent as a defence against the charge of raping a child under 16, with Baroness Casey's report, which concluded that too many grooming gang cases have been dropped or downgraded from rape to lesser charges because a 13 to 15-year-old is perceived to have been in love or consented to sex with the perpetrator. As Baroness Casey said, children are children. And if we believe that too in this Parliament, I would like to draw attention to the Scottish Government that reforms that this Parliament made in 2009. Looking back, I think were wrong, because the rape of a child aged 13 or 14 is no longer statutory rape. And I think in hindsight, I would ask the Scottish Government if they would look at that. We must take similar action in Scotland, as I've said. Just to deal with the amendments, we have one disagreement with the Tory amendment, and that is that we do believe there should be a review first, but we recognise that could lead to a public inquiry. But apart from that, we do support what the Conservatives are saying. We recognise the work that has been carried out by Police Scotland and the National Crime Agency. But ultimately, we need to show victims, past and present, that we will bring perpetrators to justice, that this Parliament and its government are not afraid to look behind difficult issues, that we will do everything we possibly can to show those victims we brought independence and do the right thing here, and show that in Scotland we are not complacent about the exploitation of children in our country.
Thank you, Ms McNeill. Could I ask you please to move the motion?
I move the amendment in my name.
The motion. Thank you very much. I now call on Cabinet Secretary Jenny Ruth to speak to and to move Amendment 19980.2. Up to 5 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, the sexual exploitation and abuse of children and young people in Scotland is not, sadly, an historic issue. It is challenging and it is complex, as we have heard. And there does require a maturity in this afternoon's debate to recognise that. I'm also mindful, Presiding Officer, that we have a relatively short debating slot this afternoon. Therefore, I will set out a number of actions today, and the Cabinet Secretary for Justice will provide further detail on the parallel work already underway by Police Scotland in her closing remarks. However, it is my intention to return to the Chamber to provide a more detailed update prior to Christmas recess. In setting out these actions today, I am particularly mindful of the needs of survivors of exploitation and abuse. Those brave young women who have come forward to share their horrific experiences of having been exploited in the past. They should not have had to relive their own trauma in order to have their voices heard. I know that Parliament debating these matters today will be difficult for many to hear. It will reopen old wounds they had hoped were long closed. We, as a Parliament, must therefore ensure that this matter is treated with the sensitivity and seriousness which it deserves and demands of all of us. Presiding Officer, it may not come as a surprise to members today, but it remains the case, shockingly, that children in Scotland are far more likely to be abused in their own homes by someone they know. Our child protection data indicates that where the main abuser is recorded in cases of child sexual abuse or exploitation, this is apparent in around 8 out of 10 cases. That context is important. However, we know the tactics used by non-familial perpetrators of child sexual exploitation and abuse mean that this harm is often hidden. In order to better protect children now and in the future, I would hope that today we can agree that Parliament must urgently understand the extent and the scale of child sexual exploitation and abuse in Scotland. This is the collective view of the National Child Sexual Abuse and Exploitation Strategic Group, which brings together expertise on this issue from social work, police, education, healthcare, academics and the third sector, as set out in the minutes of its meeting on the 25th of November, in which it stated that a number of group members stated that they did not feel there was enough information or data at present to inform a decision about whether an inquiry should take place. It was reflected that further work needed to identify the nature and scale of the issue in Scotland, so that an informed position can be taken on whether or not a public inquiry is required. It is also the view of Professor Alexis Jay, with whom I spoke yesterday. Professor Jay told me that at the current time we do not have an accurate picture of the nature and the extent of child sexual abuse in Scotland, as indeed is the case elsewhere across the United Kingdom. She went on to state that establishing this would allow us to make an informed choice about the necessity of an inquiry. I am therefore pleased to confirm to Parliament today that Professor Alexis Jay has accepted the role of the independent chair for the National Child Sexual Abuse and Exploitation Strategic Group. Professor Jay will oversee the group's ongoing work to enhance the capacity and capability of Scotland's collective response to child sexual abuse and exploitation. I can also announce today that ministers will be directing the Care Inspectorate, His Majesty's Inspectorate of Education, His Majesty's Constabulary and Health Improvement Scotland to conduct a national review to scrutinise... Yes, I'm happy to give way to the member.
Pauline McNeill.
I appreciate that, given the time. I just wanted to ask the Cabinet Secretary if she could confirm that she regards this as an independent review, given that Professor Jay, which we welcome, is going to chair it, and will she have unfettered access to all data from all the agencies she requires?
Cabinet Secretary.
To give Ms McNeill an assurance, the Inspector are independent of Ministers, so that is my understanding. However, I do want to reassure Ms McNeill that Professor Alexis Jay has had sight of the planned independent review, and I'm very pleased that she has also agreed to provide her expert advice in developing the methodology that will sit alongside that and at key stages of the review process itself. Now, the National Strategic Group will also consider the findings of the review, and it will provide expert advice to Ministers as it reports its progress. That work will be accompanied by the activity, which I've already set out is already well underway by Police Scotland, as the Cabinet Secretary for Justice will set out in her closing remarks. The Cabinet Secretary for Justice and I are clear that this work must be undertaken at pace, with Ministers being provided with iterative updates, but we also commit to regularly updating Parliament on the review's progress. And as part of this approach, I have today written to opposition leaders and spokespeople to offer a briefing with Professor Alexis Jay and with Police Scotland on this work to take place early in the new year. Presiding Officer, I also want... Yes, I will do.
Briefly, Liam Kerr.
Grateful. Does this mean that the Government is going to reject Russell Finley's amendment calling for a grooming gangs inquiry?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think, as I've set out in my statement to Parliament today, Mr Kerr, the Government has to analyse the evidence put before us. And as Alexis Jay has said, as we have heard from Ms McNeill, we do not yet have the evidence base to substantiate that decision. However, it is under active consideration, to give the member reassurance on that point. I do, Presiding Officer, in closing, want to highlight we should not forget that in Scotland we do have a live public inquiry which is already hearing directly from survivors of child sexual abuse. And whilst it is quite rightly a matter for Lady Smith and the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry to determine how to take potential group-based sexual abuse into account, where any conduct which constitutes grooming is alleged, the inquiry can, if the circumstances allow it, consider whether they are within the terms of reference of the inquiry itself. The national review I have announced today, alongside Professor Jay's leadership of the National Strategic Group and Police Scotland's ongoing work, will provide a more accurate and focused picture of the scale and response to group-based sexual harm in Scotland. This will ensure that informed evidence-based decisions can be taken on the need for further independent inquiries
Cabinet
and reviews.
Secretary, please conclude.
But above all, Presiding Officer, we must remember that this is about better protecting Scotland's children and young people from abuse. I hope Parliament will support the Government's approach in the amendment in my name today, and I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I now call on Russell Finley to speak to and move Amendment 19980.1. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. A conspiracy of silence. That was the phrase used by Andrew Norfolk, who in 2011 uncovered what became known as the grooming gangs scandal. The journalist was initially squeamish upon hearing allegations of vulnerable white girls in Rotherham being targeted by gangs of predominantly Pakistani Muslim men. But he went on to lay bare the epic scale of these heinous crimes in Yorkshire and beyond. He established that the authorities often knew what was going on, but covered it up. Police officers and social workers, fearful of being branded racist, looked the other way. And those who did try to speak out were silenced. Children in local authority care were targeted, stupefied with alcohol and drugs, trafficked and gang raped, some as young as 10 years old. And in the words of Mr Norfolk, they were treated like a subhuman species for the pleasure of these men. Yet these poor children were often branded as troublemakers, even as prostitutes. Victim blaming has never been so obscene. The crimes were abhorrent. The conspiracy of silence was shameful. 14 years after Mr Norfolk's first report, I believe there's a risk of history repeating itself. There's growing evidence that so-called grooming gangs, although I think rape gangs is much more accurate, were active across Scotland. But just as we saw elsewhere, there's also evidence that some sought to cover it up. This week I spoke with former residential social workers who suspected what was going on in the early 2000s in Glasgow, and they were told to keep their mouths shut. I've spoken with victims like Taylor, whose case files confirm a conspiracy of silence. And what will shock many is that there are actually two tiers of child abuse victims in Scotland. The Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry is closed to many due to its remit, which was set by Scottish Government ministers and which they have consistently refused to broaden. Locked out are young footballers like Peter Haynes and Stuart McMillan, who were targeted by paedophiles. Locked out is Susie Henderson, whose lawyer father allowed her to be raped by members of the legal establishment. And locked out are many of Scotland's grooming gang victims. Now, yes, some of them might be able to engage with the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry, but they've got no faith in an inquiry that has already cost taxpayers over £114 million. And they question why this inquiry granted anonymity to abusers at some of Scotland's leading private schools, yet refused anonymity to abuse victim Kevin Sutherland. His family blamed the inquiry's refusal for his suicide 1 year ago. The victims I've spoken with also have no faith in the Scottish Government's strategic group on child sexual abuse. They see it as a talking shop and controlled by the very same authorities who failed to protect them. And they're angered at the Justice Secretary misrepresenting the views of grooming gangs expert Professor Alexis Jay, who today spoke publicly about the need for urgent action. And I believe the Justice Secretary's position is no longer tenable. Presiding Officer, I end by paying tribute to Mr Norfolk, who passed away 6 months ago, and to all of Scotland's child abuse survivors who are still not being heard. John Swinney can and he should instruct a robust and independent grooming gangs inquiry without any further delay. End Scotland's conspiracy of silence. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Finlay. And could I please ask you to move your amendment? Thank you very much. I now call on Maggie Chapman to open on behalf of the Scottish Greens. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As the Cabinet Secretary has said this afternoon, the issue we debate, the sexual exploitation and abuse of children and young people, is not only an historic issue. It's happening now, in our communities, in ways we often fail to recognise. And because it's happening now, our responsibility is immediate, urgent and profound. We must do better to recognise the signs of abuse in children and young people. That means ensuring our teachers, social workers, health and social care staff, all professionals who work with children, are properly supported and confident in spotting, reporting and acting on concerns. It means doing more to support children and young people to stay safe, both online and offline, through our wider children's rights works too, to ensure they know how to respond when they feel unsafe. And where sexual exploitation of anyone is identified, whether by individuals or groups, our justice system must respond robustly and consistently. There must be no doubt we do not tolerate this abuse. But these important measures mostly come after abuse has already begun. If we are serious about eliminating child sexual exploitation, we must also confront its root causes: gender inequalities, power imbalances, social and economic inequalities, and a failure to listen properly to children whose voices have been dismissed or ignored. Disabled children, care-experienced children, migrant children and other marginalised young people face disproportionately high risks. Yet, as the Centre for Excellence for Children's Care and Protection at Strathclyde University has shown, disability and other protected characteristics are under-recorded in child protection data. We cannot tackle what we don't fully understand, so improving reporting and data collection must be a priority. And that brings me directly to the motion before us. Transparency in how we investigate and understand group-based child sexual exploitation is essential. I welcome the motion and the Scottish Government's amendments. Taken together, they recognise the independence of Police Scotland, whose statutory responsibilities are clear under the 2012 Act. They call for independent oversight of the current Police Scotland review. That oversight is important, not because we doubt the professionalism or integrity of individuals in the police, but because transparency strengthens trust. Police Scotland's work with the National Crime Agency and its participation in the National Child Sexual Abuse and Exploitation Strategic Group are crucial parts of this effort. These partnerships allow Scotland to share intelligence, respond to cross-border offending and build a clearer national picture of the risks children face now and those faced in the past. The data gathered through the strategic group is essential to determining what next steps, including a potential inquiry, are needed. And once all this evidence is analysed, then the Scottish Government must clarify as soon as possible whether an independent inquiry will take place. It's an important question, but one that must be extremely carefully handled and carefully discussed. Sexual exploitation by anyone, in any context, is abhorrent. But too often, debates around grooming gangs have been distorted by racism, religious prejudice and xenophobia. We've seen unfounded and prejudiced claims repeatedly invoked, claims that have even been disowned by those who made them initially, yet they continue to circulate, fueling division and hatred. Words like these have very real consequences for migrant communities, for people seeking safety, for MSPs, and for the cohesion and trust we need to keep all of our communities safe. Presiding Officer, we must do better in prevention, in protection, in data collection, in transparency, and in ensuring our institutions are equipped to act. But we must do so without providing ammunition to those who would use this issue to stoke hatred and fear. Our task is clear: to protect children, to confront exploitation wherever it exists, and to build a Scotland where abuse is neither hidden, minimised, nor weaponised, but eradicated. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Chapman. And I call Liam MacArthur to open on behalf of Scottish Liberal Democrats. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I start by thanking Pauline McNeill and Labour for enabling this debate. Some of the issues we are discussing were touched on in yesterday's debate on violence against women and girls, but I think it's good that we've got an opportunity to focus specifically on this challenging topic, and challenging it most certainly is. Group-based sexual exploitation of children is surely one of the most abhorrent crimes imaginable, targeting often incredibly vulnerable young people and subjecting them to horrific abuse and isolating them from support systems. All of us were horrified by the experiences of Taylor, whose heartbreaking testimony shows that there are victims of group-based child sexual exploitation and abuse across Scotland, and for most their stories go untold. They've been let down by a lack of joined-up working between agencies, a failure of safeguarding, and the perpetrators have seldom been faced with justice. It's for these young people that we owe a duty to act. So let me turn to the motion before us today, and I think it's a motion that appears to have been successful already in prompting an overdue response from the Government. I welcome the news of Professor Alexis Jay's appointment to carry out a review, and hope this will indeed lead to wider investigation. Because we know Police Scotland has been reviewing historic and ongoing child sexual abuse in Scotland since 2013. The results of this will be integral to any associated inquiry. And while duplicating Police Scotland's work serves nobody's interests, the case for increased transparency and independent oversight, I think, is a reasonable one. The investigations carried out by both Professor Jay and Baroness Casey relating to England and Wales show that institutional failures of the police and other public agencies often prevented victims coming forward to report abuse, delayed appropriate investigation and hindered the eventual prosecution of perpetrators. A subsequent failure to acknowledge these failings has since delayed access to justice for survivors. Concerns have also been raised about Police Scotland's approach to data collection in relation to group-based child sexual exploitations. Questions therefore remain as to whether methods appropriately identify the risk factors in both current and historical cases. I think Pauline McNeill was right to underline the concerns over remarkably low numbers of children recorded on the at-risk register for sexual exploitation across Scotland in the last year. Can we really be confident that the system is reliably identifying those who require support? Police Scotland are certainly to be commended for their response to many of the reports of group-based child sexual exploitation and abuse we've heard about. Yet if we're to build a complete picture of the scale and nature of the problem here in Scotland, independent scrutiny needs to be built into any review. As NSPCC warns, Scotland lacks that clear understanding at present. The Scottish Government point to the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry and the National Child Abuse and Exploitation Strategic Group in terms of adopting an evidence-based approach to this issue. Both undoubtedly are important, but both are limited in allowing a proper analysis of the extent and scale of group-based child sexual exploitation and abuse in Scotland as compared to the approach we're seeing in England and Wales. Indeed, Baroness Casey told the House of Commons that it would be a missed opportunity for the national inquiry not to extend to the entirety of the UK, given the importance of a joined-up approach. He also warned of the possibility that gangs identified in England and Wales may very well be operating across borders, including here in Scotland. Even if Scotland is to go down the route of its own inquiry, there's a strong argument, I would say, for close collaboration with the ongoing inquiry in England and Wales. Going forward, that collaboration will also be needed if we are to be effective in tackling these abhorrent crimes, ensuring prevention and protection and doing justice to the needs of some of the most vulnerable people in our society. And Scottish Liberal Democrats will be supporting the motion this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr MacArthur. We now turn to the open debate. Backbench speeches of up to 4 minutes. I call Martin Whitfield to be followed by Audrey Nicholl.
I'm very grateful, Deputy Presiding Officer, and it is a pleasure, unfortunately, to take part in this debate and to see how far that the Scottish Government have moved. But can I thank the previous contribution, which I think articulated in the first place the abhorrent history and nature and experiences of our young people that they've had to face, that has led to us to have to discuss this today, but also to the hard work that's been done by people outside of this place and beyond to give support where it's been necessary. The most recent comments by Professor Alexis Jay and the NSPCC are unequivocal about the need for an independent review of child exploitation. And indeed, as noted by my Scottish Labour colleague Joni Reid MP, Scottish Government ministers were willing to quote Professor Jay as the final word in the argument when they were mistakenly thought she was opposed to an independent investigation, and so they would be nothing more than hypocrites if they failed to act now. And to be fair, from the opening statements of the Cabinet Secretary, they are starting to act now. But unfortunately, it would appear we're going to have to wait until some point before Christmas, before getting the statement, to actually dig into the challenges that really face this, which is about the data, which is about who's going to take control. And I welcome the appointment of Professor Jay as the independent chair. I think that's a very sensible move forward. But unfortunately, those watching outside into this place will still have so many questions that need to be answered, and it is disappointing that it has taken an opposition day debate to move the government to this position. And as has been echoed earlier, I find it very challenging to think why it has taken so long to reach what I think, if we spoke to most mums, most dads, most brothers and most sisters, would have been a most obvious answer. There is a failing here and it needs to be looked into. Again, can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for drawing on the statistics about the whole global view with regard to sexual abuse that young people face, and the fact that a significant majority of that is sadly faced from within the family, and that has to be noted. It doesn't give an excuse for why we failed those that have suffered abuse at the hands of strangers, manipulation at the hands of strangers, and indeed lifelong challenges occasioned by the abuse that they have faced. Nor does it mean that we should not in any way move our eye away from supporting young people within families who face that abuse, and indeed mothers. And here we are within the 16 days of action. And yesterday we had the very powerful debate. These people absolutely, rightly, deservedly require the support both of this Parliament and the Scottish Government. But to the subject matter of the motion that's before us today and the facts that have led to this, you know, there are heart-wrenching examples of abuse, of children that were meant to be protected by a system but let down, and then a system that cast them aside. Putting our head in the sand to face of these failings is not acceptable. And I must address the Cabinet Secretary's Angela Constance when she told us in this chamber that Professor Jay was against the review and then sadly ducked the scrutiny when this turned out to be false. And again, I'm more than happy to give way.
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm grateful to the member, and can I advise him and others that when I look at the official record, I did not state at any point that Professor Jay was speaking directly about Liam Kerr's amendment to the Victims' Bill. I've never ducked anything in my life, and at some point I would be more than happy to answer questions about why I was not in chamber that day as I was travelling on government business to go to the European Union and Brussels to engage on matters of serious organised crime, including online harms and child sexual exploitation.
Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful for that intervention. But again, and with huge respect, because I do have respect for the Cabinet Secretary, that is not an answer to the questions that were posed when you weren't here, when the Cabinet Secretary wasn't here. And to go back to my opening, and to go back to the previous contribution, to go back to the opening of this debate, to go back to the opening from the opposition, we are talking about women and girls who have suffered the most horrendous abuse. We owe it to them, to a level of honesty and, frankly, a level of kindness that they have not seen. I am conscious of time, Deputy Presiding Officer, so can I just finish? Again, I'm going to quote my colleague Joni Reid from her interview this week, that Scotland has a system that is not looking. It is not willing to look. And if we cannot have, at an absolute minimum, this proper, full, independent review of the evidence of child sexual exploitation in Scotland, then Joni Reid MP has been proved to be right. I'm grateful, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Whitfield. I now call Audrey Nicholl to be followed by David Russell. Ms Nicholl.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I begin by acknowledging the Cabinet Secretary's update on the appointment of Professor Alexis Jay as Independent Chair of the National Child Sexual Abuse and Exploitation Strategic Group, a national review as well on group-based child sexual exploitation. I very much support the Government's motion this afternoon. I do, however, think it's important to reflect on the range of work already undertaken to start informing how we shift the dial in this very complex space. And in her national audit report on group-based child sexual exploitation and abuse, Baroness Casey said, and I quote, "The public are rightly appalled when they hear of group-based child sexual exploitation and expect it to be investigated thoroughly, offenders brought to justice and punished severely. And they also expect the right systems are in place to understand child sexual exploitation, who is perpetrating it, so that we can prevent it happening in the first place." And that particular audit made 12 recommendations across tightening the law, bringing perpetrators to justice, data collection and use, and applying best practice across safeguarding agencies. And of course, we've heard today about the Jay review of criminally exploited children, which looked at the scale and nature of the criminal exploitation of children. This was an excellent review with recommendations across policy and practice at a local and national level, and investment and whole system learning. And it said, and I quote, "What is required is a new system designed with the explicit purpose of tackling the criminal exploitation of children." Now, I do note that during a members' debate earlier this year, brought forward by Michael Matheson, MSP, on the review, there were no calls at that time to hold an inquiry. Now, I think it's also important to highlight Operation Beacon Port, that's overseen by the National Crime Agency, bringing policing partners together south of the border to develop a more effective response to group child sexual exploitation. And this, I hope, will provide a platform for Police Scotland to do further work to examine relevant cases, past and present. This is a crucial piece of work, and I particularly welcome the update around self-assessment across key areas of practice within Police Scotland, including data and analysis, investigation, disruption and resources. And I anticipate that this work will inform the inquiry announced today going forward. And I also, at this point, want to commend officers and specialists in Police Scotland for their work in this specialist area of investigation. I know from personal experience this work is harrowing, sensitive and very complex. So on the Police Scotland response, I think that this is what Pauline McNeill's motion relates to, and specifically on her point regarding independent oversight. And I note the Cabinet Secretary's response to Pauline McNeill's question on independent oversight. But I would note that Police Scotland is one of the public bodies in Scotland with the most scrutiny upon it, from not least of all the SPA, HMICS, various commissioners and indeed the public. And I absolutely agree there is a significant piece of work required to further enhance our response to group-based sexual exploitation of children. So I'm pleased to hear the update, as I said earlier, from the Cabinet Secretary regarding the appointment of Alexis Jay. And I very much look forward to supporting that work going forward. So in closing, Presiding Officer, I am pleased that there is now an opportunity to move forward collectively on this issue, thereby demonstrating our commitment to the public across Scotland that we are united in addressing this issue together once and for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Nicholl. I call Davy Russell to be followed by Sharon Dow. Mr Russell.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. As colleagues have already noted, this issue is fundamentally about transparency and clarity. We have seen from the Casey report in England and Wales there were systemic problems in the protections from grooming gangs. For example, victims not being believed because they were young or from a particular social background. Victims often blamed by police for what happened to them, and systemic under-recording of key data, notably around race or not to appear bias. This is why I am glad to hear the Scottish Government won't be leaving it up to the police to assess their own work here, because it's really not acceptable. There will be some who may try to turn this into another cultural war, but this will be counterproductive and detract attention away from the voices of the victims. The primary goal of an independent review should be to establish whether to further investigation and ultimately child protective measures are needed, with the added bonus that it will help to build public confidence in the government and the police and improve their ability to detect and protect. However, I am glad to hear that the Scottish Government is going to hold a review, putting to bed already festering mistrust in the background amongst the public. This will reduce the space for malign groups to profit and to sow the seed of hate. And any review should have a wide remit, amongst other factors, to find the scale of abuse, what risk factors were prevalent and what actions were taken by public bodies. Let's face it, sexual exploitation of children by grooming gangs, or anyone for that matter, is a vile, heinous crime and should carry the most severe punishment, and it deserves our full attention. If we don't protect children, who will? This means that the police must be unencumbered in their ability to record and react to gathered data of victims, alleged proprietors, not just around race, but immigration status or language, indications such as poverty, social class, even household income. Basically, no stone should be left unturned for the sake of political correctness. After all, the protection of children comes first, and this issue is about the protection of children from sexual violence. Also, public confidence in the police and the Scottish Government. But the belated decision to use its existing powers to take action in this matter is, however, welcome. I see no justifiable reason why all members should not support this motion.
Thank you, Mr Russell. I now call Sharon Dowie to be followed by Rona Mackay. Ms Dowie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This is a subject of considerable importance. When the Government voted down our Grooming Gangs Inquiry Amendment, the Cabinet Secretary told us that if we believed an inquiry into grooming gangs was necessary, we should go and make the case for one. Presiding Officer, we did exactly what she asked. We gathered what evidence we could, and what we found was deeply, deeply troubling.
In recent days, the Scottish Information Commissioner has ordered the Scottish Government to release vast amounts of material they wrongly withheld in relation to the Salmond inquiry. Clearly, they have learned nothing from it and are continuing to make the same mistakes, only now it touches on the sensitive matter of child sexual exploitation and grooming gangs. The Cabinet Secretary has repeatedly stated in the Chamber that there is no need for an inquiry, as the National Child Sexual Abuse and Exploitation Strategic Group delivers the necessary coverage and oversight. The announcement today shows the strategic group, in its current format, isn't up to the job and never was. They announced that Alexis J will now lead a review in complaints, essentially our amendment that they voted down. They need a fresh start. They need a full public inquiry, independent of government and this group. Frankly, Presiding Officer, we don't believe anything related to this group will achieve justice for victims. Our recent Freedom of Information request in the group and its work on grooming gangs was met with sweeping redactions and vast sections blanked out, including material that would have shown whether the group ever meaningfully considered grooming gangs or if they understood how to track them. Under the legislative duties of the Freedom of Information Scotland Act, when the Government chooses to withhold important material from the public, they are legally required to provide a clear and compelling rationale for doing so, especially where there is a strong public interest in disclosure. So what was their strong justification for withholding key information on their strategic group? Its impact on marine planning. That's right, marine planning on official Scottish documentation about grooming gangs. A clear, lazy copy and paste job, poor, sloppy, and it demonstrates that the Government has still not learned the lessons of the Salmond inquiry. It is continuing the same patterns of excessive secrecy, casual errors and careless redactions. Victims need transparency. What the Government has been producing isn't good enough. And the concerns about this group go beyond its scope or secrecy. It also touches on ministerial oversight, and this is probably the most concerning aspect. We saw that the Cabinet Secretary has had to be corrected in vital information she has presented to Parliament on the views of members of the group. Clearly, ministerial engagement is poor, but we didn't realise how bad it was until we submitted parliamentary questions about ministerial involvement. Shockingly, we discovered that no relevant minister had attended any of the key meetings of this strategic group. Not the Cabinet Secretary for Justice, not the Minister for Victims and Community Safety, not the Minister for Children. It is astonishing, given the collapse of the inquiry in England and the harrowing recent testimony of victims, that ministers didn't think it necessary to attend any meetings to ensure proper oversight of this group. If ministers aren't in the room, victims aren't represented. It's as simple as that. Presiding Officer, in the matter of grooming gangs, this group lacks transparency, it lacks leadership, and it has given us no reason to believe it can tackle this sensitive issue head-on. And we certainly don't have any assurances about this review. We were challenged to find evidence, we did. We asked for openness, we were blocked. We looked for seriousness, we found errors. We sought ministerial accountability, ministers didn't turn up. We don't have confidence in this group or the review to deliver full justice for victims. We need a national inquiry. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Dowie. And I call Rona Mackay. Ms Mackay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I thank the Labour Party for bringing this important and topical debate to the Chamber. Presiding Officer, sexual exploitation of children at any level is one of the most abhorrent crimes that could be committed. It's a complex, insidious form of child abuse that involves manipulation and coercion to participate in criminal activities that creates lifelong trauma for victims. And that's why I am reassured that protecting children from harm is an absolute priority for the Scottish Government. As convener of the cross-party group on violence against women and children since being elected in 2016, reports of increased exploitation are incredibly troubling to me and I know to everyone in the Chamber. The issue of grooming gangs is very complex, but I am very pleased that the Scottish Government has committed to an independent review of the handling of complaints to be chaired by Professor Alexis J. The ongoing approach by the Scottish Government is absolutely informed by data and evidence. The intensive work of Police Scotland and the National Sexual Abuse and Exploitation Strategic Group, as well as the ongoing work of the group, will help to inform the Scottish Government's approach and, of course, the review. And I'm really sorry to hear the Tories running down the experts who have been doing so much work in that group. There's a vast amount of work being done to combat this scourge in all areas, such as the ongoing work of the statutory Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry, which is considering the abuse of children in care in Scotland. No, thank you. A hugely important piece of work for many, despite what Russell Finlay says. Presiding Officer, it's always important to recognise the independence of Police Scotland and the Chief Constable in carrying out operational matters, as this can often get lost in the narrative. The crucial information and data being gathered by members of the strategic group is necessary to ensure that informed evidence-based decisions are taken on the need for further independent inquiries and reviews, and the review that we are committed to now, I'm glad to say. The group are already working at pace to identify abuse and understand prevalence, improve data collection and coordination to responses from all agencies to this abhorrent crime. The First Minister, Cabinet Secretary for Justice and Home Affairs, Cabinet Secretary for Education and Skills and the Minister for Children and Young People and the Promise have met with Police Scotland regularly and the NCSAE group to discuss the prevalence of these issues in Scotland. I was very pleased to receive an invitation from the Cabinet Secretary from Education, along with members of the Criminal Justice and the Education Committees, to meet Professor Jay and Police Scotland in the new year. Presiding Officer, the Labour motion calls for us to clarify our position on grooming gangs, and I hope they now have that clarification. The Conservative motion calls outright for an inquiry, but hasn't really outlined what shape or form such an inquiry should take. To be clear, the UK are not carrying out a national inquiry into grooming gangs. Rather, it's a targeted regional inquiry, 5 local investigations into areas of concern. In February, the UK Government established the National Audit on Group-Based Child Sexual Exploitation and Abuse, that's the Barness Casey Review, to evaluate the scale, nature and drivers of exploitation. And it reported in June 2025 that this led to the UK Government announcing an independent commission on grooming gangs. It's not yet been established and a chair has not yet been appointed. As we know, Liam Kerr first brought forward an amendment about the Victims Commissioner being asked to carry out research into group-based child sexual exploitation in the Victims Bill, and he likened this to the Casey Review to build a national picture of what is known about grooming gangs in Scotland. Since that particular ask, though, it's been portrayed by the Conservatives as a vote by my party against grooming gangs, and this misinformation was incredibly troubling to all of us who care about the welfare of children. Nothing could be further from the truth, and I really regret the extent to which this issue has been politicised. Surely we should be working together. Surely we should be working together to eradicate this vile crime and gather much-needed evidence before squabbling and scoring political points. So I look forward to hearing about the progress of the independent review and its vital work to protect children.
Remarks to close. Thank you very much. Yes. Thank you. There is, I would advise, just a little bit of time in hand, so I can be a wee bit generous with members' times. With that, I call on Liam Kerr to close on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives. Up to, around 4 minutes.
Well, Presiding Officer, I've been shocked and stunned listening to this debate today. Partly it was hearing about some of the horrific details of this most heinous and vile of crimes, like Russell Finlay telling us about victims Peter Haynes, Stuart McMillan, Susie Henderson, or Pauline McNeill and others, reminding us of Taylor, who spoke out so courageously recently and talked of terrible institutional failures, or Kevin Sutherland, who ultimately took his own life. And we mustn't forget how in October 5 members of a grooming gang in Dundee were jailed after raping and sexually abusing 10 women, some as young as 16. and how last January 7 were jailed after findings that 3 victims under the age of 13 were subjected to horrific sexual abuse and violence in Glasgow over a 7-year period. But I was also shocked because of what we've heard about the appalling lack of data and evidence about things like the scale of this problem, how cases are handled, where the system is failing victims. Pauline McNeill and others reminded us of Baroness Casey, saying that there's insufficient data. According to a minute of a meeting in October, the Scottish Government's own chief statistician said the data on these crimes being incomplete or inaccurate was a good starting point. The CSA Workforce Deep Dive report confirms it, saying, and I quote, "There is a lack of robust data on the scale of child sexual victimisation in Scotland." Just today, Professor Alexis Jay is on record saying, "We do not have a clear or reliable picture of what the present situation is in Scotland, and we do not know enough of the scale of child exploitation in Scotland." Now, despite this, as Sharon Dowie told us, the Cabinet Secretary has repeatedly stated in this chamber that there is no need for a full inquiry because the National Child Sexual Abuse and Exploitation Strategic Group delivers the necessary coverage and oversight. But this assertion is found wanting. Because firstly, a freedom of information attempt to find out what the group was doing was met with sweeping redactions and vast sections blanked out, including material that would have shown whether the group was actually meaningfully considering grooming gangs. And secondly, of course, today, the Scottish Government has asked Professor Jay to review handling of complaints against grooming gangs. And although, as Martin Whitfield pointed out, we lack details, surely this is an admission, if ever one was needed, that, as we always suspected, the strategic group was not covering what is required here. But the Cabinet Secretary for Education is right. We must understand the extent and scale of this. So, Presiding Officer, I am truly stunned that after hearing this harrowing testimony, after hearing about the lack of data on the scale of it, the lack of knowledge of victims' experiences, where institutions are failing, and yesterday's reports that Professor Alexis Jay thinks ultimately there could be a full grooming gangs inquiry, SNP MSPs will vote against the Russell-Finlay Amendment, which simply instructs a full grooming gangs inquiry in Scotland. It appears that, having been presented with another opportunity, they will again reject the opportunity to launch a grooming gangs inquiry, simply because something far short of an inquiry has been floated today without us having any details of it. I won't take the intervention just because I'm running out of time. Presiding Officer, decision time is, I think, still 10, 12 minutes away. There is still time for those MSPs to reconsider. I urge them to do what is right, not what they have been told. And that means voting for the Conservative amendment to establish an inquiry into grooming gangs in Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Kerr. I now call on Cabinet Secretary Angela Constance to close on behalf of the Scottish Government. Around 5 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I am pleased to participate in today's debate with my education colleagues who lead in child protection. But of course, every Scottish Government Minister has a duty and a role to protect our children, actually, as we all do as parliamentarians. And one member from the opposition benches earlier made the important point of people working together, not just on the ground in our communities, but here at a national level. I will in a moment speak to the Justice contribution to what is a sensitive and complex issue, which has in its heart the protection of children now and in the future, and the voices of survivors and victims in the past. The Scottish Government, like others today, recognises that the sexual abuse and exploitation of children are abhorrent crimes with devastating impacts on the victims. We know, I know, that throughout time and society there are individuals who seek to abuse children and will use every means they can. That is why we should all rightly be concerned about the current threats and challenges, including the 20% year-on-year increase in reported online child sexual abuse. Presiding Officer, as Justice Secretary, I want to address the role of Police Scotland. Oversight of their work is through the Scottish Police Authority. That is so by legislation, and I know we are all aware of it. And on that point of oversight, it was just last week that Police Scotland provided comprehensive update to the SPA on its activities in relation to group-based child sexual abuse and exploitation. And this highlighted Police Scotland's response to the establishment of Operation Beaconport in England and Wales, and the Chief Constable confirmed support for a UK-wide law enforcement approach. And Police Scotland are taking a coordinated and aligned approach to that being taken by police forces in England and Wales as they respond to the findings of Baroness Casey's audit of group-based sexual abuse. And they are reviewing past investigations, and if evidence of group-based child sexual abuse and exploitation is identified, cases will be referred to the National Crime Agency, who are providing another layer of additional independent oversight. And if the conclusion is that further investigation is required, then that would be led by Police Scotland. And in a meeting with ministers last week, Police Scotland highlighted that we have strong foundations in Scotland to tackle these harms, including the ability of the police to take a national approach through the National Child Sexual Abuse Investigation Unit. And it is essential that we await the outputs from this work and Police Scotland's further activity to develop an overview of the demographics of suspects and offenders of these crimes, to identify any key patterns or trends before any decision can be made on a national inquiry into this issue. And the only point I would make with respect to Mr Finlay's amendment is that it pre-empts the work that Ms Schoolruth and I will oversee, work that we want to take place with pace. Our position has always been that this is a matter that we were given the most serious and careful consideration to. And the points that members, perhaps in a moment, the points that members have made, which was directly raised by Mr Kerr about the importance of data, also made by Mr MacArthur and Mr Whitfield. And it's a point that I have consistently agreed with. Child protection has grown in breadth and complexity, and therefore we need new and improved data to understand the scale and nature of the threat that is now evolving and changing, a threat that exists now to our children. We have to recognise, and we do, that harm is hidden and that sometimes those risks are not immediately in front of us. Yes, Mr Kerr.
Liam Kerr.
Just very quickly, so what is the Cabinet Secretary's objection to a full grooming gangs inquiry then?
Cabinet Secretary, I can give you your time back.
Yes, because we have taken advice from Alexis J. We have taken advice from the Child Sexual Abuse and Exploitation Group. We are looking at the work that Police Scotland are doing, and the view that is coming back in terms of right now is that we need to do work right now to get a more comprehensive picture to consider the matter further. But I do emphasise to Mr Kerr that our position has always been that we are giving this matter very serious and detailed consideration, and also the importance of the work in terms of that the various inspectorates will now do in terms of that review is absolutely crucial, because yes, that will help to inform our view about the need for any further type of inquiry, but crucially, it will also inform our view about what needs to be done in our services, on the ground, in our communities, today and tomorrow, to protect our children. So this work that is ongoing right now is about what we can do to actively intervene in the lives of our children in the here and now, but we are deeply alive to the lessons of the past that we can and must learn from. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And I call on Katie Clark to close on behalf of Scottish Labour. A generous 6 minutes.
Thank you. Scottish Labour brought this motion today because we believe there must be accountability, transparency and justice. And we believe that the Scottish Government has been complacent on group-based sexual exploitation and abuse. The individuals, organisations and public bodies which fail to protect children and young people, especially girls, must be held to account for their failings. And we believe that victims and survivors must have confidence in that process. We need full transparency from government, police, local authorities and other relevant bodies about how and why these failings occurred. The children and young people subjected to such appalling abuse and exploitation deserve justice, including a commitment from this Parliament and from the Scottish Government that all steps will be taken to ensure that such crimes never happen again. Like other members, I welcome the announcement from Police Scotland last week that there will be an audit to identify any child grooming gangs reported to the force since 2013. We know that there are significant problems with child abuse and grooming in Scotland. This audit is key to help identify patterns, trends or concerns in relation to the demographics of suspects and offenders. It is vital in helping to build a clearer picture about the scale of this abuse and exploitation across Scotland. It will contribute to the ongoing work of the National Crime Agency's Operation Deacon Port, which forms a broader UK law enforcement approach to this issue. And if the audit does identify any potential issues for reinvestigation, it will also hopefully lead to convictions for those who have been engaged in these crimes. However, members have rightly questioned whether this audit will inspire the confidence and trust of victims. After all, Police Scotland have been accused of failing victims of group-based sexual exploitation and abuse. And that's why Scottish Labour believes that independent oversight of this audit is vital if Police Scotland are to have the confidence and trust of victims. Independent oversight is not uncommon, and it's not uncommon or inappropriate in relation to Police Scotland reviews and audits. The Scottish Police Authority already stands... Yes, of course, I'll take an intervention from the convener.
Audrey Nicholl.
I thank the member for giving way. It was just to kind of highlight the points that I made earlier on with regard to the scrutiny that already exists above Police Scotland from the Scottish Police Authority. Obviously, they're accountable to the SPA and a range of other organisations. So I'm not sure that there is a lack of scrutiny, but I accept the point that you're making about independent review.
Katie Clark, you can have your time back.
I would disagree with the member on that particular point, but she's absolutely correct to say, as I've just said, that the Scottish Police Authority already stands as an independent governance body for policing in Scotland. However, having served on the criminal justice for more than 4 years with her, I would say that there's a need for far greater scrutiny of policing in Scotland, and I think that's something that we're very aware of as a committee. The Scottish Government has previously commissioned independent reviews, such as that taken by Lady Eilish Angelini into police complaints, and the Police Scotland itself has also established independent oversight bodies such as the Equality, Diversity, Inclusion and Human Rights Independent Review Group. So we believe the independent oversight of this audit is appropriate and would not undermine the operational independence of Police Scotland. So we welcome the appointment of Professor Alexis Jay and reiterate our view that this role needs to be independent and have full unfettered access to all information and records. Polly McNeill and Rona Mackay have spoken about the audit that was undertaken by Baroness Casey in relation to group-based abuse and exploitation of children and young people in England and Wales. Whilst recognising that many of Baroness Casey's recommendations apply to other parts of the UK, we also think it's appropriate that the Scottish Government look at that work and provide an update to identify what can be implemented in relation to any recommendations in Scotland. I also understand that the First Minister previously stated that the Scottish Government is doing work on child protection policies and practices through the National Child Sexual Abuse and Exploitation Strategic Group. However, it would be helpful if the Minister could clarify how survivors and other relevant stakeholders are being engaged in this work to ensure that there is no further child exploitation of vulnerable children and young people in the future. Members have rightly highlighted the recent powerful testimony of Taylor, the care experience survivor of human trafficking and child abuse, and indeed have talked about many other children. All of the bodies that we've spoken about today have failed to take safeguarding and reporting action necessary in the past. Taylor herself has called on the First Minister to establish an inquiry, and Scottish Labour support her in that call. We do believe an inquiry is vital if we are to establish why there has been a lack of intervention and investigation into cases like those of Taylor. The National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children has rightly stressed the need for ministerial leadership to establish the true scale of this child abuse and exploitation, particularly in relation to group-based abuse. So, whilst we think that the Scottish Government has been slow to call for an inquiry and to show leadership into group-based sexual exploitation and abuse, we also believe that the review can help to determine the extent of grooming in Scotland and the remit of any inquiry, which is why we believe that the review is required, and so will support the Scottish Government in that work, but we do believe that it's likely that that review will lead to an inquiry.
Thank you. That concludes the debate on transparency in tackling group-based child sexual exploitation and abuse. It's now time to move on to the next item of business. And the next item of business is consideration of business motion 19992 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a business programme. And I call on Graham Day to move the motion.
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Minister. No member has asked to speak to the motion. Therefore, the question is that motion 19992 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed. The next item of business is consideration of 4 Parliamentary Bureau motions, and I ask Graham Day on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau to move motions 19993 and 19994 on approval of SSIs, 19995 on committee meeting times, and 19996 on committee membership.
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Minister. The question on these motions will be put at decision time, and I'm minded to accept a motion without notice under Rule 11.2.4 of Standing Orders that decision time be brought forward to now, and I invite the Minister to move the motion.
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. The question is that decision time is brought forward to now. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed, and there are 7 questions to be put as a result of today's business. Can I remind members that if the amendment in the name of Neil Gray is agreed to, the amendment in the name of Sandesh Gilhani will fall. The first question is that Amendment 19977.1 in the name of Neil Gray, which seeks to amend Motion 19977 in the name of Jackie Bailey on crisis in social care, be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division. And we will have a short suspension to allow members to access the digital voting system.